You get home at 3:40 in the afternoon. The key is on a shoelace around your neck, still warm from being under your shirt all day, and you already know the house is empty before you open the door because the driveway is empty too. Inside it is quiet in a particular way. The answering machine light is not blinking. There is a note on the counter about what to take out of the freezer. You pour cereal, you turn on the television, and for the next 3 hours, nobody on earth knows exactly where you are or what you are doing, including the two people who love you most, and nobody thinks that is strange, because in that year it isn't. Here is what that afternoon teaches you about people, and it goes further than 1 decade. We talk about generations like they are personality types, like being born in 1987 installs a set of traits the way a factory installs a part. That is not what happens. A decade is not a personality. A decade is a set of conditions, and conditions train habits, and habits harden into what later gets called character. The people who grew up in the 1990s were shaped by a very specific set of conditions that has since disappeared completely, and if you understand those conditions, you will suddenly understand a lot of adults you know, maybe including the one in the mirror. So let me walk you through 7 of them, what each one trained, and what each one quietly cost. Before the first one piece of honesty that matters. Generational psychology is one of the weakest areas in the whole field. Researchers have a hard time separating the effect of the era you grew up in from the simple effect of how old you are right now. And most sweeping claims about a generation's personality do not survive contact with the data. So you will not hear me claim that the 1990s made anyone better or tougher. I am going to tell you what the environment actually demanded, which is something we can describe honestly, and then let you decide what it built. Start with the one underneath all the others. Everything cost something. Not money, effort. If you wanted to talk to your friend, you called their house and their mother answered, and you had a short conversation with an adult before you were allowed to get to the person you actually wanted. If you wanted a song, you waited by the radio with your finger on record, and you accepted that the DJ would talk over the first 4 seconds of it. If you wanted a movie, you drove to a building, and if the last copy was rented, you drove home with something else. Every single want had a small tax of friction attached to it, and you paid that tax so many thousands of times that paying it stopped registering as a cost at all. What that trained is not patience exactly, it is something more useful. It is the unexamined assumption that the gap between wanting a thing and having it is normal, and that the gap is your job to cross. Adults who grew up that way often cannot explain why they are willing to sit through a slow process that other people abandon at minute 2. They are not more disciplined. They just never learned to expect the gap to be missing. The second condition is the one that sounds almost impossible now. There were hours in the day when you could not be reached. You left the house on a bike and you were, in the fullest sense of the word, gone. There was no device in your pocket, no location dot on anyone's map, no message waiting to be seen. The only way to reach you was to physically find you. That produced a nervous system that was never trained to stay half alert to an incoming signal, and you can still see the residue in how those adults behave now. They put the phone face down. They go 6 hours without checking it and feel no particular anxiety about it. They will call you back tonight instead of texting back in 40 seconds, and they genuinely do not understand why that reads as coldness to someone younger. The cost of that is real too, and it shows up in the other direction. Some of them are bad at the small maintenance that modern closeness runs on. The little check-in, the quick reply, the constant low hum of contact, because they were built for a world where you were either together or you were not. The third condition is the one people romanticize and then completely misdescribe. There was nothing to do, constantly. Long stretches of a Sunday with no plan and no scroll and no infinite catalog. Kids in that era spent an enormous number of hours simply bored, staring at the ceiling of a room, walking to the end of the street and back. What we know now is that a wandering, unoccupied mind is not an idle mind. It is running the network the brain uses for imagining, planning, and rehearsing situations that have not happened yet, and that network needs unstructured time to run it all. There is a serious argument in developmental research, made most forcefully by Peter Gray and colleagues in a 2023 paper, that the long decline in children's independent, unsupervised activity is connected to rising mental health problems in kids and teenagers, precisely because unsupervised time is where a child learns they can handle things. The 1990s were not the golden age of that. The decline was already well underway, but those kids still got a dose of it that a child today mostly does not, and the habit it left behind is the ability to be unstimulated without immediately reaching for something. The fourth condition changed the size of the world. Your world was 12 houses on a block, one school, one mall, maybe one cousin in another state. That was the entire population you compared yourself against. Social comparison is not a modern invention. It is one of the oldest findings in social psychology, going back to Leon Festinger in 1954, and it says we work out our own worth by measuring ourselves against the people around us. The variable that changed is not the instinct, it is the sample size. When your comparison set is 200 people you know, you land somewhere in the middle of it most days, and the middle is a survivable place to live. When your comparison set becomes every person on earth who is better than you at the exact thing you care about, sorted and delivered to you daily, the middle disappears as a category. That is why so many people who grew up in the 1990s describe a specific feeling of having been, at the time, unremarkable and fine with it. They were not more secure. Their measuring stick was just shorter. The fifth condition ran on a clock, and it is the one that has vanished most completely. Culture happened to everybody at the same moment. The show aired Thursday at 8, and if you missed Thursday at 8, you missed it. And on Friday morning at school, you stood at the edge of a conversation you could not join. Nobody chose that. It was simply how the pipe worked, and because there was one pipe, the whole country was pointed at the same thing on the same night. What that builds inside a person is a default assumption that other people have seen what you have seen, that a reference will land, that you are standing in a shared room. Adults from that era often carry a low-grade loneliness they cannot name, and this is usually the source of it. It is not that they miss the shows, it is that they were formed inside a synchronized culture, and they now live in a world where every person they meet is watching something different. So the reference does not land, and the shared room is gone. The trade was worth making. Almost nobody would give up having a choice, but there was something on the other side of that trade, and the people who remember it are not imagining it. The sixth condition is the one that changed the inside of the head. You could not look things up. If a group of people at a table disagreed about who was in a movie, the disagreement stayed open. It stayed open through dinner, through the drive home, sometimes for weeks until somebody's uncle settled it or a magazine did. Living that way does two things to a mind. It makes you carry a lot more inside your own head, because your memory is the only copy you have, and it makes you tolerant of unresolved questions, because unresolved was the normal ending. Psychologists studying what happens when a search engine is always available have found that people are less likely to remember the information itself and more likely to remember where to find it. Your memory quietly reorganizes around what it can outsource. The people who grew up before that shift often still hold facts, names, directions, and phone numbers in their heads with no filing system behind them, and it feels to them like an ordinary skill rather than the strange leftover it actually is. The cost, and it is a real cost, is that a person trained to argue from memory can also be confidently and completely wrong for a very long time with no one to check them. The seventh condition is the one you only notice when you look for a photograph and there isn't one. Almost nothing was recorded. A childhood in the 1990s exists in maybe 200 photographs total, most of them badly framed, all of them taken on purpose, plus a small pile of tapes nobody has a machine for. Everything else survives only as memory, and memory is not a recording. Memory is a reconstruction that gets slightly rebuilt every time you visit it, which means people who grew up then have a relationship with their own past that is closer to storytelling than to footage. Their childhood is a set of scenes they have retold so many times the retelling is the thing that remains. Someone growing up now will be able to watch theirs. That difference is going to matter more than we currently understand, and the people it applies to cannot easily explain to a younger person why they get so protective of a story that no evidence supports. Now step back, because this is where it gets more honest and more uncomfortable. There is a version of this conversation that turns into a victory lap, where the older person lists what they survived and implies the survival made them superior. That version is not true, and it skips the bill. So let me put the bill on the table. Those same empty afternoons were also the largest natural experiment in unsupervised childhood this country has run. By the late 1980s, estimates put the number of American children spending part of the day in self-care somewhere between 7 and 15 million, and roughly 40% of the generation just ahead of them is estimated to have come home to an empty house. Some of those kids got competence out of it, and researchers studying after-school self-care in the 1990s did find that moderate amounts of solo time left some children feeling more capable, not less. Others got 3 hours of low-grade fear and a habit of never mentioning it. Both outcomes came out of the same empty living room, and which one you got depended on things a 9-year-old did not control. There is a second part of the bill. That cohort came up in the long shadow of the highest divorce rates in American history. The rate peaked in 1981 at 5.3 divorces per 1,000 people and only began its slow decline in the early 1990s, which means a very large number of these childhoods included a house that split, a parent who left, or a friend's family that came apart with no explanation offered to any of the children involved. The habit that gets built in that environment is not toughness. It is a quiet decision, made early and never revisited, that you handle your own problems because handling them yourself is faster than explaining them to an adult who is already underwater. That decision is extremely useful at 11 years old. It is a real problem at 40, when it shows up as a person who is competent at everything except asking for help, and who cannot understand why the people who love them keep saying they feel shut out. So here is the reframe, and it changes how you read almost everybody you know from that decade. What looks like a generational personality is almost never a personality. It is fluency in an environment. Those adults are not more patient. They are fluent in friction. They are not more independent. They are fluent in being unreachable. They are not calmer about the world. They are fluent in a smaller one. Take that same person and drop them into a childhood of constant contact, infinite comparison, and total supervision, and you would get a different set of habits out of the same human being. That is why the arguments between generations almost never go anywhere. Both sides are describing the water they learned to swim in and mistaking it for a description of their own character. And if you were that kid, this is the part worth sitting with. The environment that trained you no longer exists, which means some of your best instincts are now solving a problem nobody has. The friction you learned to pay is gone, and the tolerance you built for it is a genuine advantage in a world where most people quit at minute 2. But the other lesson, the one that came from the quiet house and the note on the counter, the lesson that said handle it yourself and do not make it anyone else's afternoon, that one was never actually true. It was just the fastest available answer for a 9-year-old with a key on a shoelace and 3 hours to fill. You are allowed to go back and give that kid a different answer now. If this put words to something you have never been able to explain to anyone younger, a like and a subscribe go a long way.